Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 33. The Occupation of Scotland. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the House of Lords: Robert, Baron Bowles, David, Baron Goodman, and Chris, Baron Abbott. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica. Last time, we saw the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War. After several major battles, the naval war between the Commonwealth of England and the United Provinces of the Netherlands finally came to an end. The English had usually come out ahead in these battles by virtue of their approach to naval warfare. Massive warships, overwhelming firepower, and strict discipline countered the Dutch approach of disable and board, with the state's navy learning and reforming as the war went on. But both countries were hurting. Besides a few English merchants who were making a killing from captured Dutch shipping and goods, the political wind was now blowing towards peace. Both Lord Protector Cromwell and Grand Pensionary de Witt wanted to end the war, and after many months of negotiations, a treaty was finally agreed. As we saw, Cromwell's major win was the Act of Seclusion, which, secretly, forbade the States of Holland from ever putting the Prince of Orange in power. Considering the family ties between the House of Orange and the House of Stuart, and that Holland was the wealthiest and most politically influential province of the Netherlands, as long as the Act stood, the Commonwealth had neutralised the threat from its neighbour. Today, we'll look inward, to Scotland. At the same time that the Anglo-Dutch War was raging on the seas, the English occupation of Scotland was facing some difficulties. Last time we saw Scotland, representatives had been summoned to discuss a union with England. Before that, after the final holdout of Dunnottar Castle surrendered, 8 commissioners had been appointed by the Rump Parliament to ensure that religious toleration was implemented, that the political union was enacted, that financial reparations were seized from Crown lands and from royalists, and that a general amnesty was applied to the population. Only the leadership were meant to be tarred with the guilt of the Third Civil War. That said, across Scotland, many households were subjected to free quarter. As we've seen many times before, this was a form of punishment as much as it was a cost-saving measure for the army. Having a load of soldiers living in your home, eating your food, drinking your beer and whiskey without paying for a penny of it could bankrupt a family. Once it was decided that the occupation was going to be long-term, and the Scots invited into a union, the commissioners quickly replaced free quarter with the slightly less bankrupting monthly assessment, or cess, of £10,000 a month. That said, the new model army's discipline was mostly upheld, and harsh punishments were handed down by officers against soldiers who harmed the civilian population. These ranged from whipping through the streets, such as in the case of one soldier accused of attempted rape. The would-be rapist was then imprisoned at the Lieutenant General's pleasure. Whipping was also used to punish theft and more consensual fornication. More imaginative punishments included having heads tied to feet, being dunked in the sea multiple times, having to ride a wooden horse with heavy muskets tied to their legs, or running a gauntlet of their comrades. There were also what you might call the classics: public humiliation, by being forced to stand to attention wearing a paper which listed your crimes, and, of course, execution for the most serious cases. Many Scottish contemporaries did acknowledge, however begrudgingly, that the army's discipline was maintained and its soldiers kept on a short lead. But that didn't mean that the military occupation of Scotland was well received by the Scots. Apart from the obvious, that a military occupation is very rarely welcomed, the English soldiers weren't just soldiers. They were no mere mercenary army, after all. This was an army of saints. Independents and Congregationalists now held all the cards in Presbyterian Scotland. It was only a few years ago that the Presbyterian Kirk demanded that the English adopt its system of church government, and the soldiers and officers of the new model army had not forgotten that. A committee of those officers assembled at Leith and began to administer justice, and one item on the agenda stands right out: witchcraft. Between 1649 and 1650, Scotland experienced perhaps its worst witch panic. Maybe I'll cover it in depth on the history of witchcraft someday. And the English officers began investigating the accusations. In 1652, juries of soldiers threw out the charges of several accused witches, and these women were freed. But witch trials continued in the 1650s, simmering, ready to boil over after the Restoration. English nominees were made principals of 3 of Scotland's 5 universities: Glasgow, Edinburgh, and King's College, Aberdeen. The principal of Aberdeen's other college, Marischal College, was William Moyer, and he had already declared his support for the Congregational Way, independency, and had been suspended by the General Assembly of the Kirk for it. Presumably, the commissioners viewed Moyer as trustworthy and left him in his post. The 5th Scottish University, St Andrews, was treated with a light touch when the commissioners arrived, and were simply told that they needed English approval for any new hires. Nevertheless, St Andrews resisted English control in other ways. When the 1652 class was due to graduate, the normal ceremony was replaced with a private laureation, because the full graduation would require the students to subscribe to the incorporation of Scotland into the Commonwealth. It was a small act of resistance, but it was resistance. Other differences of theology were less orderly, and sometimes the occupying garrisons took a heavy-handed approach to fixing the tyranny of presbyteries. Presbyterian ministers were banned from praying for the king, which, that makes sense for the Republican English to enforce. Presbyterian stools of repentance, which parishioners deemed to have sinned or transgressed the community were forced to stand on and be publicly rebuked, were vandalized or stolen by English soldiers, except where they mockingly used them as actual seats during Presbyterian sermons. In these sermons, they often heckled the minister, or debated their theology in front of the whole parish. When Kirk assemblies met, the army often marched in, heckled, or even dispersed the meetings by force. There were some Scots interested in independency, and there were occasions where independent officers and soldiers met privately with them. Just as Scottish fears of English political dominance had proven true, so too did their fears of religious contamination. The hotbed of ideas that was revolutionary England had spilled over the border, and Presbyterian Scots raged at the spread of Quakerism and other sects which the army had brought with them. When Cromwell had chased Prince Charles south, he'd left George Monk in command. Since then, we know that Monk will be transferred, with great success, to the States Navy to fight the Dutch. Monk had left Major General John Lambert and Richard Dean to govern in his absence. They only stayed for a few months. Lambert was recalled to England to bring his talents to bear, as we've also seen. Dean would follow Monk into the Navy, where his career ended via a Dutch cannonball. This meant that Major General Robert Lilburne was made Commander-in-Chief in Scotland from December 1652 until April 1654. To quote Gentles, Lilburne was nothing if not conscientious, but he hated his job almost from the beginning. End quote. And it's hard to blame him for that. His job was really tough. He had to enforce discipline among his soldiers and try to build up goodwill amongst a population which generally despised the occupation. Let's talk about our old friend Archibald Campbell, the Marquis of Argyll. Last we saw him, he was placing the crown on Charles II's head at Scone, just before the young king rode south to defeat. Since then, the English had been trying to bring him into the fold, along with other Highland clan chiefs. They held too much influence in their regions to be allowed to coexist. They needed to submit. Argyll was far too wily to simply give the English what they wanted, though. Between October and December 1651, so after news of Worcester had reached them, Argyll had been negotiating with the English, but the discussions ended with nothing confirmed. Well, nothing except for the untrustworthiness of the Marquis of Argyll, thought the English. When the tender of incorporation was proclaimed and representatives were summoned to meet at Dalkeith, Argyll sent a representative to the meeting. The commissioners believed that this was a sign that the powerful Highland lord was prepared to submit. So they met with him again in March 1652 and found out that no, he wasn't. He still wanted to negotiate. Now the commissioners rejected this outright. The only terms that were acceptable to them were the terms proclaimed by Parliament. The meeting broke up without an agreement, but with Argyll's promise to let the English garrison his territory, and that he would send deputies to Dalkeith, but they didn't get his submission. There followed an exchange of letters, with Argyll refusing to accept that he, the most powerful aristocrat in Scotland, was being offered the same deal as everyone else, and the commissioners telling him, yes, that's all you get. His representatives arrived at Dalkeith, subscribed to the tender of incorporation, and then listed the demands of Argyll, finishing with an implied threat that only Argyll's support could let the English govern his substantial territory. What made this implied threat meaningful was that the English knew it was true. Argyll needed to be brought into the tent, or else who knew what damage he could do outside it. Eventually, finally, after months of back and forth, Argyll accepted that he had to submit. An English military campaign was planned for the Highlands, and Argyll had no effective means to resist it. So he submitted, and he actually got some significant concessions out of it. There was a bit of a misunderstanding in August, when Argyll was invited onto Major General Richard Dean's ship. A formal salute was made as the Marquis boarded, which was only polite. But Argyll's men, still on land, took that as proof that their master had just been kidnapped by the English. A short-lived Highlander rebellion spread across the area, with several English garrisons besieged, before Argyll himself could ride around and calm things down. He agreed to pay a little bit more, to pay for the damages and to smooth things over. After all, what's a little light rebellion between friends? The Highland campaign effectively secured English dominance of the country, but it did not pacify it. Forts and garrisons were established from Perth to Kintyre, but English control of the Highlands was patchy and limited. This left them militarily vulnerable, and it also reduced their ability to gather intelligence, and that in particular would cost them. But the English had the personal submission of the Marquis of Argyll. The leading figure in Scottish politics and the most powerful noble in the Highlands had been brought into the fold. And though there was still unrest in the Highlands, Highlanders sometimes took pot shots at patrolling soldiers, and occasional gatherings of hundreds of clansmen spooked the wider occupation. But surely, Argyll on their side, this low-level violence wouldn't escalate? It couldn't. Not without leadership. After the break, we'll find out why they were wrong. The English occupiers of Scotland had made a mistake. They understood that resentment and unrest was rife among the people of the Highlands, and they'd worked hard to keep the most dangerous potential leader of any rebellion, Argyll, safely out of the running. It had taken them months of difficult negotiation, but they finally got his personal submission. Though they didn't trust him, he had some kind of stake in the new regime now. But the English authorities had not realised that the unrest was already being channeled. It was already being led, not by Argyll, but by other Highland lords, with their own ties to the exiled Stuarts. In June 1652, the man who would be king, the exiled Charles Stuart, was sitting in comfortable exile in Paris when he received a letter. It came from a group of his Scottish subjects, noblemen and clan chiefs, who promised to rise in rebellion for their king. Now Charles was not a great fan of Scots. His time in his ancestral kingdom had been brief, and filled with dour Presbyterian lectures from Kirk ministers and patronising guidance from lords like Argyll. But even so, this was positive news. Combined with the recent outbreak of the Anglo-Dutch War and the naval skirmishes between France and the Commonwealth, this might present a way for his triumphant return to his inheritance. Divided at home and besieged on the oceans, the Republican experiment could be ended. Charles quickly replied, thanking his loyal subjects for their support, reminding them how much he'd always loved Scotland, and urging them to assist their new commander, Lieutenant General John Middleton. We last saw Middleton at the Battle of Worcester. He was a former engager who had fought in the Duke of Hamilton's ill-fated invasion of England. He'd then fought with Charles in his own ill-fated invasion of England. He was captured after Worcester, but he managed to escape a likely execution and fled to France. His king now gave him overall authority of the Scottish project, and Middleton set to work raising men, money and supplies for an invasion of Scotland. After many months of work, he didn't get much, and the idea of an external intervention died on the vine. It was clear that the Scottish rebels would have to help themselves, with all the moral support they could possibly need from their king and their general, who would stay in France. In August, Charles swallowed his pride, difficult for a king, and wrote to the moderator of the General Assembly of the Kirk, urging him to keep morale high. The correspondence between occupied Scotland and the court in exile continued into November, when a messenger arrived with news. He excitedly told Charles and Middleton that the Scottish royalists included MacDonald of Glengarry, Clan Fraser, Clan Ranald, the lairds of Maclean and Macleod, and many others who had all promised 1,000 men each for the rebellion. There were others too who promised a few hundred each. These would-be rebels begged their king for commissions for themselves and letters of encouragement for others. They asked for supplies, for weapons, and for Lieutenant General Middleton to come and lead them in person, if it wasn't too much trouble. Charles replied, promising help and supplies, and, wisely, because we're talking about Highland politics here, to put aside any personal grudges and work together. He soon drafted commissions for Glengarry, Sir James MacDonald of Sleat, and many more, and gave them the authority to act as a council of war and elect their own commander until Middleton got there. Middleton took one look at these commissions, especially those allowing for an interim commander, and vetoed them. He wasn't going to get to Scotland for some time yet, and he wasn't going to let his authority be questioned in his absence. By the end of 1652, there'd been a lot of ink spilled, but little to show for it, as Middleton tried to run a rebellion in the Highlands of Scotland from Paris. Meanwhile, the English were simultaneously aware that the Highlands were more restless than usual, but they didn't realise quite how orchestrated the unrest had become. Reports of moss troopers and bandits attacking and killing isolated Englishmen, civilians as well as soldiers, were becoming increasingly frequent. Even an army captain stationed at Braemar was murdered by a group of Highlanders. Stocks of weapons and ammunition were found around the town of Paisley and across Fife, which warned the English that the danger might not be limited to the Highlands. And yet, the English simply did not recognise that these events were connected, that they weren't individual acts of disorder or localised plots, but instead the early warnings of the storm to come. Next time, we will see that storm break, as the Highlands rise against their English occupiers and for their king over the water. This is the last week you can submit questions for the English Revolution Q&A with David Crowther. We have some really good ones already, but I don't believe you can have too much of a good thing. The link in the description will be open until the 14th of July. Thank you to my House of Lords, particularly the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duchess of Wellington, Sue Bremner, the Marquess of Oxford, Dominique, and the Earl of Atlanta, Gary. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.